Thank you to our fellows for these amazing presentations, and thank you to Rotarians and the Rotary Foundation for your support of these students. I am Erica Johnson. I teach in global studies here at UNC, and I serve as the director of our graduate studies program. The fellowship obviously benefits these students. You can see the amazing work that they do, but it benefits our programs and campuses so much as well, so thank you. I am going to start with the moderator's privilege of asking the same question to both of you, but I'll also ask our audience to prepare your questions. Put your hands up already so the microphones are ready when we hear the first ones. We have a shorter time period for this Q&A part. So my question to you both, you work in challenging environments with vulnerable communications. You have deep professional and academic experience. What practices or strategies do you use to remain optimistic or center yourselves in this difficult work? Patrick, yeah, you can go first and then we'll go to Jack.
I think two things. We've discussed about this earlier, like both me and Jacinta talk about deep listening. I think that's one thing that I've learned. I'm still a learner. I'm a learner. And I don't stop learning about deep listening, regardless of who the kind of person I'm talking with, whether it's young people or maybe the elders. The second, I think, is also acknowledging that in the world, it's not always good. There's also the other side, the bad things. But at the end of it, like, I always look at the possibilities and hope. And I do this by connecting with young people, which I'm very passionate of, including marginalized young people. So I think those two things keeps me sane and keeps me hope. And also the good things that they're doing.
I would say never underestimate the power of a hug, a good laugh, and a good cry.
Right, who in our audience is brave to ask our first question? Here you go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Both presentations were amazing, but my question was directly to Jacinta. First of all, thank you so much for talking about how can we, connect to roots, which is super important. $100.
200. Can I hear 3?
Okay, so I know not all of us can go to a deep dive volunteer program, So how might we help other people, probably elder people, sorry for that, is to build that connections with Earth, to reconnect with themselves, to be able to understand we all live in this world, in this harmony, in this balance, and then we can take action to preserve that.
Beautiful question. I think there are lots of ways that we can do it. And certainly please don't take away from this that I want you all to go to the Amazon. That is the opposite of what I want you to do to build a connection. We can build a connection right where we stand. A land acknowledgement is an entry point to start doing that. When we take time to reflect and understand who the land is as a being, not just a resource, it starts to repair those relationships. I also, locally, like here in the United States of America, there is a group, the Duke-UNC, and they have a Duke-UNC address, which is also known as the Thanksgiving address. It was something that was given at the beginning of a gathering with the pilgrims, and it's kind of how Thanksgiving seemed to have got its name. But this is a longer land acknowledgement, and it takes time to acknowledge the streams, you know, the sun, the animals that give their life to feed us. And I really encourage you all to go and find this. If you don't know how to spell it, I don't blame you. Come find me after and we can find it together. But it is a really beautiful way of reminding us the ritual of belonging that we go through every day. We wake up, we take our coffee, you know, we say hello to our friends, we check our emails. It is adding another ritual, because this isn't something you can do at the end of the week. It's something we need to start incorporating each day. The land holds and supports us to thrive each and every day. And it's a very small act of gratitude that we can do just to incorporate her in our daily rituals, give her thanks, give her love. And by doing that, I believe we naturally will shift more of our extractive practices to practices of care, love, and harmony that don't just benefit us, but benefit many generations to come.
Yeah.
My name is Muhammad Ali. I'm the president of Rotary Club at Methodist University. First off, what a phenomenal speech from Janataga. So I absolutely agree with you that, you know, humanity has definitely lost this touch and this meaningful connection that we have with land. And it's a rupture that's, you know, has been not just accelerated, but also exacerbated by the industrialization, the urban sprawl, the digital literacy, and AI, and all sorts, and also the colonial systems that have redefined the land, and from something, you know, that's very communal to us into something that's owned, that's extracted, and, you know, commodified in many parts of the world today. So this connection shows up everywhere, be it like we don't even know where our meals come from, for example, like, you know, children don't have green spaces to grow around, kick a ball in the park in many parts of the world. And, you know, entire generations, we're losing stories and rituals, you know, which people once shared, especially our ancestors on shared pieces of land. But, you know, your project clearly touches on something significant, but I believe it's also very timely. We need to take it like, I have two questions.
Give us one.
Two. They're both important. Yeah, they're both important. Okay, two questions. You can answer them in one, I think. So first, how does your project help participants move beyond a one-time experience like nature park walks or community garden visits to building an ongoing relationship with the land? And that includes, for example, responsibility and also the reciprocity and regeneration of land and understanding its cycles. And the second question is, how do you address the privilege that comes with the land access today, especially when many marginalized groups have been historically removed and excluded from their lands through displacement, gentrification, and, you know, environmental climate damages?
Two really important questions. The first one I think I kind of touched on with, it's about rituals, about rituals of belonging. The second one, thank you for raising this. I think it is really important that we acknowledge there's access barriers when we're talking about land. I'll give you a very brief story because I know time's on the clock. But when I went to the beach in North Carolina as an Australian, I was really shocked and overwhelmed. Not only because the water was a lot colder than it is in Sydney, but because there was only two public access points, one on one end and one on the other. In Australia, you cannot own the beach. You cannot own the sand. That is public land. That is for every single person to enjoy. And I think in this country, that's a big question. Who gets access to this land? It's not just about parks, right? It's about restoring our relationships with place, and land is an essential part of that. So I think in this country, it looks different to in my context in Australia. In this country, it looks like advocating for public land. You know, public land ensures that everyone has access to place. It also ensures that then we protect people from building right up to the shoreline, which takes the beach away from everyone, especially from future generations. So when we're talking about public space, it's not enough to have parks. It's not enough just to have national parks that then Indigenous communities don't have access to either. That needs to be a part of the conversation. Protecting land for people to enjoy has to include allowing Indigenous peoples their sovereign rights to continue ceremony, to continue their stories, and to continue these ways of caring for land that we have forgotten or are still learning. If you're interested, there is an amazing national park in Colombia called Parque Tayrona who does this well. For a month of the year, it is closed to coincide with an important Indigenous ceremony. And for that month, the Indigenous community is the only people who are allowed to access it. They decide who comes in, they benefit from the tourism, but most importantly, other people going and enjoying that land does not come at a cost to those Indigenous peoples, their stories, or their cultural survival. So public land, invest in her, love her, care for her. We all have a responsibility to advocate for that.
We have a question from our online community. Sorry,
This is a question for Patrick. How has working with young people affected and influenced you as a peacemaker?
It's a very good question. I'll need 2 days or 3 days to talk about that. In the spirit of time, because that's really my passion. Like in the spirit of time, it really contributed a lot to my journey as a person, as a human being. I think one thing that I always admire back home is that when I was doing this, I always get grounded to my Indigenous background, which is connecting with not only like just young people, but trying to put up a platform where it's intergenerational. So the elders, and even as Jack said and mentioned about the spirits and the ancestors and Mother Nature, we try to put that in a collective platform. The second, I think, is expanding the platform also, because often, I know there's already, to start up, there's already the Rotary that the Rotary is working with. The way I'm saying it, it's a very helpful platform for young people, but I think we need to expand that further, because what's happening mostly is that it's educated young people, the privileged young people. The young people that I've worked with are the illiterate, the most that are not always seen by society, like Indigenous and Muslim young people that I've worked with in the Philippines and even in Kibera in Kenya. These are like migrant young people, which are not often visibly seen by society. And the way I'm gonna be advocating further in this platform is really, let's work with Rotary, but maybe also further expand that when we're doing our community works. That would be more inspiring and hopeful.
This is for both of you briefly. So I think whether it's coming from young people, whether it's addressing, especially in this country, some of the legacies of colonialism in terms of land ownership and, and populations living there. What are some entry points for people who are trying to have conversations with their neighbors, with their Rotary Club members, to talk about these things and find solutions without feeling confrontational?
It's a big question, a question that can be applied to many situations in life that we are all living right now. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think it really comes from deep listening. So often we go into these conversations, I did this when I was a younger person, learning about the history of the land that I hadn't learned, coming into my family dinner table, ready to fight, right? I was ready to be like, no, this is why we need to acknowledge land. It's not a way to have a conversation. It doesn't create a dialogue, And so I think what I have had to learn, and part of the journey at Tranby and here continued at Rotary has reminded me of again and again, is like, how do you enter that conversation? Because that's going to affect how the conversation goes. Are you ready to have your point heard? Or are you ready to invite questions with curiosity? Because this is a conversation that has a lot of feeling and a lot of fear attached to it, right? It is really hard to recognize that you didn't learn the full history of your country growing up. It doesn't get easier with time though. Once we start learning, we do have a responsibility to keep learning and unlearning, which is a big part of the journey. And so I think being really grounded in yourself and being willing to have those tough conversations with yourself, feel the emotions, move through it, do the research, but then get ready to talk to people and remind yourself when you're entering those conversations, like, Is my goal here to listen and understand? Because that'll help them make sense of their journey versus coming in with your agenda and you want them walking out doing one thing and one thing only. These are hard conversations to have, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. If anything, it shows us why we need to have them and the fact that if we keep avoiding them, it doesn't make the conversation easier. So to some, have those hard conversations with yourself, enter these dialogues with curiosity and with a willingness to learn and just explore.
Just expand that further about deep listening. 2 points. One is acknowledging the present situation. I think we could do that by, as Jacinta said, in the indigenous culture, like even acknowledging the land, acknowledging the people, where they're coming from, because always in that kind of community, there are people who had been traumatized, and acknowledging that both as a divider, but also as a connector. So there's always 2 sides of the coin. The second point is use creative arts. That for me has been useful in both age spectrum. Like I've used that for young people. I also did that with the elders when I'm doing a facilitative kind of community works, like use the creative arts so that everyone can have a platform, but also a space to share. It should not just be dominated of one person who's always articulate, who's always have the knowledge, because I always believe that each one of us, the diversity of our ideas, our experience, our lived experience, and even our insight is always beautiful and always contribute to the dialogues.
Are there other in-person questions or Zoom questions? Yes. Where's the fastest?
Chris.
Here we go.
To be honest with you, this is one of the most interesting topic, and I'm actually surprised to hear it from you coming from Australia, because I want to take you to South Africa for a moment, where land issue is a big deal. So how would you approach the Afrikaners who basically taking the land through a brutal way of indigenous land from South Africa? What would you tell such people that don't want to listen? They don't want to acknowledge that the land was taken in a way that was unfair and a brutal way. Like, how would someone like you approach such people?
Big question. Important question. And from I don't know a lot about South Africa right now and what's happening politically, but I do know that its history shares a lot with Australia's history. I think that it's important when we enter these spaces and conversations to remember, as my wise thesis advisor reminded me earlier this week, you can't have this conversation at this time with every person. Right? There are people who are ready to have this conversation, and there are people who won't be ready for 10 years. And you've got to work within that spectrum. In Australia, there are still people that don't acknowledge that we live on Aboriginal land. But because Aboriginal community members and because a lot of activism has happened over the generations, we are now at a place in our history that Aboriginal flag is flown at our Parliament building. There is not one politician that can walk into business every day and not recognize, whether they want to or not, that we are on Aboriginal land. That doesn't mean politics are perfect. That doesn't mean we don't still have challenges of racism, as I'm sure South Africa, as we all know, still does, right? But it's how we have the conversation, not as and I've got good having this conversation with my own father, but saying that it's Aboriginal land doesn't mean these communities are saying for me to leave, right? This is my home too. This is where I've been raised. The question is, if we both care for the land, how are we caring for it? Are you just seeing it as a piece of property? Because if so, that's a different kind of system. If we both see it as a relationship, we both recognize its importance in our future, our children's and grandchildren's future, then it shifts the conversations we start having. I spoke about the eucalyptus and fire management, and this is something that is still ongoing in Australia. Aboriginal cultural burning is the best way to look after our land. You've all seen that Australia suffers from big bushfires. One of the reasons that this happens is because Indigenous bushrangers were not given the rights to manage the land in the ways they had done for over 65,000 years. After the last big bushfires in my state, New South Wales, there was a big conversation that happened. And part of it was that when they looked at where burned and where didn't, unsurprisingly, the parts managed by Indigenous fire burning did not have the destructive wildfires that other parts of the state did. It reminds us, listening to Indigenous stories is not about saying that this is not my place of belonging. We can't go back, but we have a choice in how we move forward. And so the question is, are we willing to care for the land? And if so, how do Indigenous peoples need to be included? It's not about saying this isn't my place too, but it's about recognizing that my ancestors are a tiny blip of the Australian story. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been there for over 65,000 years and many generations. If we don't listen to those stories, we will not know how to care for our land, and we will not have a future for my hopeful children and grandchildren of the future.
Just to add to that, as an Indigenous person also, I think in the Philippines, we're still learning and we're still in a journey of even as far as this model in Australia. I think as an Indigenous person, I always say, like, in this context, we could always, it's a long journey, but at the same time, in the journey, we could always find allies. And that's what we've been doing in the Philippines. So even like acknowledgement of the land is not yet a practice. We have an Indigenous law. It's there, but it's not like even like applied as it's written. So I think at the end of the day, each country has its own journey and context that we need to look at. We could look at other countries as example, but we could also like go back inside and look at, based on our homeland, what are some of these Indigenous practices that maybe we could use, like intergenerational collective action, those kind of practices that we could also like work and expand with our counterparts also from the other members of society. I think that for me is also like a good way to move forward.
Is there one quick question? One more quick question. We're now standing between lots of questions at lunch. So maybe we invite everyone to take your questions to the fellows, continue the conversation. The next panel starts exactly at 1:40.
Thank you.